You're watching the Everything Network. Dino Calabro belongs to the darkest lane of the modern Colombo family. His story is not a glamour story, not a boss story, and not a myth about old neighborhood honor. It is a murder crew story. It moves through the wreckage of the Colombo War, the Persico faction's revenge culture, the killing of rivals, the killing of an off-duty NYPD officer, the disappearance of a family underboss, and the collapse that came when a shooter turned into a federal witness. The Colombo family had already been damaged by civil war before Calabro became one of the names federal prosecutors used to explain its violence. The war between the Persico faction and the Orena faction left bodies, prison terms, broken crews, and years of suspicion inside the family. The public often remembers the Bonanos for internal chaos, the Gambinos for succession politics, and the Genovese for quiet power. The Colombos had something else attached to their modern identity, internal bloodshed that never fully left the organization. Calabro rose inside that world. Federal court records describe him as an associate under Tommy Shots Gioeli during the 1990s. Gioeli was a major Colombo figure, later described as a street boss. Calabro became a MAID member around 2000 and was made a captain shortly afterward. That path matters inside the Colombo structure. He did not enter the record as a distant hanger-on. He moved from associate to soldier to captain after years around a crew. Prosecutors tied to murder, racketeering, loan sharking, robbery, narcotics, extortion, and old Colombo war violence. The first great federal blow came in June of 2008. Prosecutors unsealed a 17-count superseding indictment in Brooklyn against Thomas Gioeli, John Sonny Franzese, Dino Calabro, Joey Caves Compatiello, Orlando Spado, and others. The charges included racketeering conspiracy, robbery, extortion, narcotics trafficking, and loan sharking. The indictment also listed murders and murder conspiracies tied to the family's violent record. This was a vertical strike at the Colombo family: leadership, captains, soldiers, associates, and murder crews in one federal case. Calabro's name appeared in several violent charges. Prosecutors charged him in the January 9th, 1992 felony murder of Carlos Pagan, an armored truck guard killed during a botched robbery outside a Brooklyn check cashing store. They charged him with Thomas Gioeli in the March 25th, 1992 double murder of Colombo soldier John Minerva and Michael Imbergamo. Minerva was a target from the Colombo War. Imbergamo was killed after being with him. They also charged Gioeli, Calabro, and Joey Caves Compatiello in the June 12, 1991 murder of Frank Marassa, who was shot outside his Brooklyn home. Those charges placed Calabro inside the violent core of the Persico side aftermath. The Colombo War did not end cleanly when the shooting slowed. Old enemies remained. Suspicions remained. Men who had backed the wrong faction could still be marked. Crews that had learned violence during the war carried that method into the years after. Calabro's federal story begins in that environment: robbery, murder, faction discipline, revenge, and advancement through violent service. The case became even heavier in December of 2008. A new superseding indictment charged old cold case murders, including the killing of NYPD officer Ralph Doles and the murder of former Colombo underboss William Wild Bill Cotolo. The government named Joe Waverly Katas, Dino Calabro, and Little Dino Saraceno in the Doles murder. It named Thomas Gioeli, Calabro, and Saraceno in the Cotolo murder. These were not ordinary mob counts. They touched two of the most sensitive killing lanes in the Colombo record: a murdered police officer and a murdered underboss. Ralph Doles was killed on August 25, 1997. He was an NYPD officer assigned to Police Service Area No. 1 in Brooklyn. He was also married to the ex-wife of Joel Kakase. Prosecutors said Kakase ordered the murder, and that Calabro and Saraceno waited outside Doles's Brooklyn home. When Doles parked his car, they shot him multiple times and left him dying in the street. Doles died a short time later from the gunshot wounds. The Dole's murder cut across one of the oldest underworld boundaries. Killing law enforcement carried enormous risk. It brought federal and local pressure that could last for years. Yet prosecutors said the murder grew from Kakasi's personal humiliation over his ex-wife's marriage to Dole's. That motive made the killing look even more reckless. A police officer was murdered not in a broad strategic war against the state, but in a personal grievance filtered through Colombo power. Calabro's later cooperation gave the Dole's case its sharpest courtroom detail. He admitted taking part in the killing and testified that he did not know Dole's was a police officer until he saw the headline afterward. That claim became part of the case's ugly tension. It did not make the murder less serious. It showed the reckless blindness of the crew. They had followed an order, killed the target, and only then learned the full weight of who had been left in the street. The Kutolo murder belonged to a different part of Colombo politics. William "Wild Bill" Kutolo had been underboss, a powerful figure tied to the family's war years and post-war tensions. Prosecutors said he was killed in May of 1999 after Alphonse Persico and John de Ross feared he had become too powerful. The government charged that Kutolo was shot in Saraceno's basement apartment and buried in Farmingdale, Long Island. His body was recovered on October 6, 2008. Kutolo's murder had the feel of internal discipline at the highest level. An underboss does not vanish without political meaning. The killing sent a message inside the family. It removed a man with status, followers, and possible claims to power. In the Colombo world, leadership paranoia could turn a ranking man into a target. The same family that had already torn itself apart in war still treated internal strength as a danger. Calabro's name also appeared in the murder of Carmine Gargano. Prosecutors charged him with ordering Gargano's 1994 murder. Gargano was 21 years old, shot at a Brooklyn chop shop, and his body was never recovered. This detail adds another layer to Calabro's image. He was not only described as a participant in orders from above, he was also charged as a man capable of ordering death himself. The number attached to Calabro later became almost unbelievable. Reporting around his sentencing said he admitted involvement in 8 murders. That figure put him in the category of a serious mafia killer, not a man caught on the edge of one old case. 8 murders meant a career built around violence, silence, and trust, inside a crew where killing could help a man rise. It also meant the federal government had gained a witness carrying years of internal Colombo history inside his own memory. Calabro began cooperating after the 2008 arrests. That decision changed him from defendant to witness. In mafia terms, it was the final break from every oath and every old rule. In federal terms, it was the opening of sealed rooms. A man who had taken part in murders could explain who ordered them, who drove, who waited, who shot, who buried, who lied, and who collected the benefits afterward. The cost was clear. He would never again be seen as a Colombo man. He would live as a protected witness, hated by the same world that once used him. The government needed men like Calabro to reach old murders. Cold cases are hard to prove when bodies are gone, witnesses are dead, and street memory has been trained into silence. A cooperating killer gives prosecutors a map through the old violence. He can place people in cars, basements, houses, and meetings. He can explain motive. He can identify shooters. He can tell agents where a body was buried. That is how old mafia cases come back to life years later. But a cooperating killer brings a courtroom problem. The jury has to believe a man who admits he lied for years, killed for years, and joined the government only after facing life. Defense lawyers can attack every part of that witness. They can argue he is saving himself. They can argue he is shaping stories to please prosecutors. They can show contradictions, memory gaps, old grudges, and benefits from cooperation. Calabro was powerful evidence, but he was also vulnerable evidence. The 2012 trial of Thomas Gioeli and Dino Saraceno showed that tension. The government used cooperators, including Calabro and Compatiello, to present the history of Gioeli's crew and its murders. The trial lasted several weeks. The jury convicted Gioeli and Saraceno of racketeering conspiracy, but the verdicts were mixed. Gioeli was found guilty of racketeering conspiracy tied to murder conspiracies, yet he was acquitted on the substantive murder counts. Saraceno was convicted of racketeering conspiracy and other charges, but he also avoided conviction on several direct murder counts. That mixed verdict did not erase the government's case, but it showed the limits of relying on violent cooperators. Jurors accepted enough to convict on racketeering. They did not accept everything needed to convict on every murder charge. Gioeli later received 224 months in prison. Saraceno received 50 years. The Colombo crew had been badly damaged, but the courtroom record remained complicated. Saraceno's sentencing kept the violence in the record, even after the jury's split verdict. In 2014, federal prosecutors described him as part of one of the most lethal and feared crews in La Cosa Nostra. He was sentenced to 50 years after convictions that included racketeering conspiracy, spanning nearly 2 decades, murder conspiracies, extortionate credit, and witness tampering. Even where specific murder counts failed before a jury, the sentencing record treated the crew's violence as central to the punishment. Joel Cacase's case created another charp courtroom turn. Cacase was accused of ordering the Ralph Doles murder. Calabro and others placed him in the government's theory of the killing. But in November of 2013, a jury acquitted Cacase of the Doles murder charge. That acquittal became one of the most important reminders in the entire story. A cooperating killer can reveal old violence. He cannot guarantee conviction. For the families of victims, that kind of outcome carries a brutal weight. Doles was dead. Calabro admitted involvement. Saraceno was accused and later punished heavily in racketeering terms, but the direct murder verdicts did not land the way prosecutors wanted against every alleged organizer. The legal system produced punishment, but not the clean, full accounting prosecutors sought. That is one reason the Calabro story has such force. It is not a simple government victory. It is a record of truth, violence, plea deals, acquittals, and partial justice. Calabro's sentence arrived in November of 2017. Instead of life, he received 11 years after cooperation. The number angered people who saw his admissions and the bodies attached to his past. A man connected to 8 murders walked away from the life sentence he once faced. The judge credited his cooperation. The public could still look at the result and see the harsh bargain at the center of organized crime prosecutions. To reach men above and around a killer, the government sometimes makes a deal with the killer himself. That bargain sits at the center of modern mafia justice. Without turncoats, many old murders remain buried with the victims. With turncoats, prosecutors can reopen graves, indict leaders, identify shooters, and explain the structure. But the price is bitter. The witness receives credit for telling the truth only after years of enforcing silence. Calabro's 11-year sentence became the perfect example of that trade. He helped cripple parts of the Colombo family, and he received a sentence far lighter than the violence of his past would suggest on its own. The Colombo family appears in this story as an organization where violence became self-defeating. Murders were supposed to protect power. They instead created witnesses, long investigations, buried bodies, and federal cases that lasted decades. The family killed to maintain authority. The killings became the evidence that pulled authority apart. Calabro's cooperation turned the family's own violent memory against it. The Doles murder gives the story its moral center. A police officer came home, parked outside his building, and was shot down in the street. The alleged motive came from personal resentment inside an organized crime figure's life. The shooters carried out the act under the logic of obedience. Years later, one of those shooters sat in federal court and described what happened. The full damage could not be repaired. The case could only expose what had been hidden. The Cutolo murder gives the story its political center. A family underboss was summoned, killed, hidden, and left in the ground for years. His death showed the fear inside the Colombo administration. Power did not protect him. Rank did not protect him. Reputation did not protect him. In that family, a man could rise high enough to become dangerous to his own side. The Pagan, Minerva, Imbergamo, Marasa, and Gargano lanes give the story its murder crew center. They show Calabro moving through armed robbery, faction violence, revenge, and crew enforcement. The names are not decorative. Each victim marks a separate piece of the Colombo family's violent economy. A guard killed during robbery, a soldier killed in a war, a friend killed after being in the wrong place, a target shot for suspected involvement in another murder, a young man killed and never recovered. The old mafia promise was protection, order, and brotherhood. The Calabro record shows the opposite. It shows a family that used men until prison or death arrived, then watched those same men cooperate under pressure. It shows captains, soldiers, and associates tied together by fear, money, and murder, not loyalty strong enough to survive federal prosecution. When the indictments landed, the rules changed. The oath gave way to sentencing exposure. On the street, his name carried weight through violence. In court, that same violence made him hard to believe. The more he admitted, the more prosecutors could use him. The more he admitted, the more defense lawyers could point at him as a murderer trying to save himself. He became both the government's weapon and the defense's target. That tension is why this case remains valuable for understanding the modern mafia. Federal prosecutors did not defeat the Colombo family only through surveillance or one informant. They attacked old murders, broke participants loose from the code, used cooperation to reconstruct the past, and then faced the difficulty of selling that reconstruction to juries. The result was not perfect. It was still devastating. Gioeli went to prison. Saraceno went to prison for 50 years. Calabro entered witness protection after an 11-year sentence. Cachassi beat the Doll's murder charge. The old crew never returned to what it had been. Calabro's final meaning is grim. He was not the highest boss. He was not the most famous Colombo name. But his cooperation opened a window into how the family used violence after the war, who was targeted, where victims were taken, how orders moved, how bodies disappeared, and how old crimes stayed alive inside the memories of men who committed them. He rose through murder, then survived by explaining murder. The closing record is a hard one. A Colombo captain tied to some of the family's ugliest violence admits involvement in 8 murders. A police officer's killing becomes a federal cold case centerpiece. An underboss's body is found after years in the ground. A street boss and a soldier receive long sentences, but several direct murder charges fail. A former shooter receives 11 years after cooperation. The old Colombo code survives in memory, then collapses in court. Big Dino Calabro's story is the Colombo family stripped down to its most severe form: faction loyalty, personal revenge, contract violence, buried bodies, and the witness stand. The family war created men like him. The federal system later turned men like him into evidence. In the end, the same violence that helped him climb became the evidence that helped bring the crew down.
William Wild Bill Cutolo rose within the Colombo crime family during a period when the mafia still believed brute authority could outlast government pressure, a time when reputation mattered as much as revenue and fear still carried currency in the streets of Brooklyn and Staten Island. Cutolo was not a subtle man, nor was he designed to be. His authority came from physical presence, an explosive temper, and a reputation for violence that preceded him into any room. Within the Colombo hierarchy, he represented an older model of power, one built on intimidation, personal loyalty, and visible dominance rather than distance and insulation. By the 1980s and 1990s, this approach was already becoming dangerous, but Cutolo thrived on confrontation, believing that strength displayed openly discouraged betrayal. He commanded crews involved in gambling, loan sharking, and labor racketeering, and he enforced discipline personally, ensuring that subordinates understood the consequences of disobedience. In an era of shifting mafia norms, Cutolo stood out as a throwback, respected by some, feared by many, and quietly resented by others who saw his volatility as a liability. The Colombo family itself was uniquely unstable, plagued by internal divisions that had lingered since the violent civil war of the early 1990s, between the Persico loyalists and the Arena faction. Although the shooting war had officially ended, the scars remained embedded in the organization's culture, fostering paranoia, grudges, and fragile alliances. Power within the family was fractured, with acting bosses, street bosses, and captains maneuvering constantly to protect their own interests. In this environment, Cutolo aligned himself firmly with the Persico leadership, seeing loyalty as both a moral obligation and a strategic necessity. His promotion to acting underboss reflected not only his earning ability but his willingness to enforce Persico authority without hesitation. Yet that same rigidity would eventually place him at odds with newer figures who favored quieter methods and survival over confrontation. As the late 1990s approached, law enforcement pressure intensified, forcing Colombo leadership to adapt or disappear. Surveillance, informants, and racketeering prosecutions made traditional displays of power increasingly risky, and some within the family began to view Cutolo's behavior as a threat rather than an asset. He was known to challenge decisions openly, to confront perceived slights directly, and to demand respect in ways that drew attention. While his loyalty to Persico was unquestioned, his refusal to evolve created tension with other captains and administrators who preferred caution. Meetings became strained, alliances grew thinner, and whispers circulated that Cutolo was becoming uncontrollable. In a criminal organization where perception often mattered more than truth, the idea that a man might be too dangerous could be as fatal as actual disloyalty. Cutolo's personality exacerbated these divisions, as he possessed little patience for politics or compromise. He believed hierarchy existed to be enforced, not negotiated, and he expected obedience to flow downward without friction. This attitude clashed with a Colombo family increasingly defined by internal balancing acts, where survival depended on avoiding unnecessary exposure. Those beneath him feared his temper, while those above him worried about the attention he attracted. The very traits that had elevated him now isolated him, creating an invisible line between Cutolo and the rest of the administration. He sensed this shift, but misjudged its severity, trusting that his history of loyalty would outweigh any concerns about his behavior. As internal tensions grew, so did the role of intermediaries, men who navigated between factions and relayed information selectively. These figures became power brokers not because of rank, but because of access, controlling what leaders heard and what they did not. Cutolo, accustomed to direct communication and open confrontation, underestimated the influence of these quieter operators. Decisions about leadership, discipline, and even survival were increasingly made in conversations he was not part of. The Colombo family was evolving into a structure where silence mattered more than strength, and Cutolo was ill-suited to that transformation. His presence, once reassuring, now made others uneasy. By the early 2000s, Cutolo's position had become precarious, though outwardly unchanged. He continued to act as a senior figure, issuing orders and maintaining his crew, but beneath the surface his standing was eroding. Those who once deferred now avoided, and those who once supported him now hedged their loyalties. The Mafia, for all its talk of honor and tradition, has always been ruthless about self-preservation, and Cutolo's volatility made him a risk others were unwilling to carry. Conversations began to shift, from how to work with him to how to neutralize the problem he represented. In that world, such a shift was often irreversible. Unaware of the depth of the threat forming around him, Cutolo remained confident in his position, trusting in the old rules that had governed his rise. He believed loyalty would protect him, that history mattered, and that fear still commanded obedience. What he failed to recognize was that the Colombo family had entered a new phase, one where leadership sought invisibility, adaptability, and deniability above all else. His style belonged to an earlier era, and the organization was quietly preparing to move on without him. The seeds of betrayal were already planted, watered by fear, ambition, and the belief that survival required sacrifice. This internal fracture set the stage for one of the most consequential betrayals in modern mafia history, a feud that would not only claim Cutolo's life, but unravel what remained of the Colombo family's stability. The decisions made in whispers, behind closed doors and through intermediaries, would ripple outward, drawing in sons, allies, and enemies alike. What followed was not merely a murder, but a chain reaction of retaliation, cooperation, and exposure that accelerated the family's decline. Cutolo stood at the center of it, unaware that the ground beneath him had already given way. The mafia, as it always has, was preparing to erase one of its own. By the time the Colombo family's internal machinery turned decisively against William Wild Bill Cutolo, the feud was no longer theoretical but operational, moving through back channels with a quiet urgency that belied its consequences. Meetings took place without him. Conversations ended when he entered rooms, and trusted faces began offering reassurances that sounded practiced rather than sincere. In social clubs and parked cars, senior figures spoke in lowered voices about stability, about heat, about how certain personalities were becoming liabilities in an age where the government seemed to hear everything. One captain was heard telling another that Wild Bill was still fighting the last war, while a third muttered that loyalty meant nothing if it brought indictments. These weren't arguments made openly. They were conclusions reached gradually, reinforced by repetition and fear. Cutolo sensed resistance, but interpreted it as weakness, telling associates that the family needed backbone, not hiding. What he didn't realize was that his words were already being repeated elsewhere, reframed as proof that he couldn't be controlled. As the tension hardened into intent, intermediaries became essential, men whose value lay in their ability to deliver messages without leaving fingerprints. In these exchanges, names were rarely spoken plainly, replaced instead by nods, glances, and phrases like "the situation" or "that thing in Brooklyn." One administration figure reportedly leaned back in his chair and said, almost casually, that the noise has to stop, to which another replied that some people don't know when to shut it off. The implication hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. There was talk of options, of calming him down, of sidelining him temporarily, but each alternative collapsed under scrutiny. Someone finally said that Wild Bill wouldn't step aside, and no one disagreed. Silence followed, the kind that confirms a decision without announcing it. Cutolo himself continued to move with confidence, holding court, issuing directives, and reminding anyone who would listen that he had been loyal when others hedged. In one conversation, he reportedly scoffed at the idea that the family would turn on him, telling a close associate that they know who kept the streets in line when things got ugly. He spoke of Persico with reverence, insisting that history mattered and that the old rules still applied. Yet even as he talked, his circle was shrinking, invitations thinning, calls going unanswered. When he confronted one captain about the distance, the response was evasive, a vague comment about timing and pressure that explained nothing. Cutolo dismissed it, but the unease lingered. Behind the scenes, the mechanics of removal advanced with chilling efficiency, framed not as betrayal, but as necessity. A senior figure was overheard saying that Wild Bill was too loud for the times, while another added that the family couldn't afford another internal war sparked by ego. The language was clinical, managerial, stripping the humanity from the outcome. In these discussions, Cutolo was no longer a man but a problem, a variable that needed resolution. The decision did not require unanimity, only acceptance, and acceptance came easily once fear entered the equation. The Colombo family had learned that survival favored decisiveness, even when it meant erasing its own. The final phase required proximity, someone Cutolo trusted enough to meet without suspicion, and that trust would prove fatal. Conversations turned toward logistics, toward finding a setting that wouldn't raise alarms, toward ensuring that the act would be clean and final. One voice reportedly asked whether there might be consequences, whether this could fracture what remained of the family. Another answered that the fracture already existed, that this was simply acknowledging reality. There was an understanding that once crossed, there would be no return, no explanations offered, no mourning permitted. The Mafia has always understood that authority survives only if doubt is eliminated swiftly. Cutolo's last movements reflected his confidence in personal relationships over shifting politics, a miscalculation rooted in an outdated understanding of power. When a meeting was proposed under the guise of settling tensions, he reportedly accepted without hesitation, remarking that men talk things out, as if the family still operated on that premise. In his mind, confrontation resolved conflict. He had never learned that silence could be deadlier. As he prepared to leave, those around him noticed nothing unusual, no heightened caution, no sense of impending danger. Trust, once earned, had blinded him to warning signs that might have saved him. The die had already been cast. The murder itself, though brutal in consequence, was efficient in execution, carried out by men who understood the weight of what they were doing and the necessity of completing it without hesitation. There were no speeches, no dramatic declarations, only action followed by immediate disappearance. In the aftermath, the family moved quickly to control the narrative, describing the event in vague terms and discouraging questions. One figure reportedly told a curious associate that things happen, a phrase that closed the door on further discussion. The message was clear. This was settled business. Shock rippled outward, particularly among those who had believed Cutolo untouchable, and fear followed close behind. Some questioned the decision privately, while others reassured themselves that survival demanded compliance. The family closed ranks, presenting a unified front even as internal trust eroded further. In back rooms, someone quietly observed that if Wild Bill could be taken out, no one was truly safe. That realization changed the tone of every subsequent interaction. Power no longer felt anchored, it felt conditioned. Unbeknownst to many within the Colombo family, the consequences of this feud were far from contained. Cutolo's murder would not end with silence or acceptance, but with a reaction no one fully anticipated. One driven not by mafia calculus but by personal loss. His son, watching events unfold from the outside, would interpret the killing not as business but as betrayal, and that distinction would prove catastrophic. The decision made in whispers was about to echo far beyond the family's control. What followed would expose secrets long buried and accelerate the collapse already underway. The aftermath of William Wild Bill Cutolo's murder unfolded not with the clean finality the Colombo family expected, but with a slow, destabilizing unraveling driven by emotion rather than protocol. In the immediate days following his disappearance, the family enforced silence, instructing members to avoid speculation and to treat the absence as settled business. Older figures reassured nervous subordinates with familiar phrases, saying that things were handled and that asking questions only brought trouble. Yet beneath the surface, anxiety spread because Cutolo's removal had crossed an invisible line. He was not a marginal figure or an expendable problem. He was a senior power whose loyalty had once been unquestioned. That reality made many wonder who might be next and whether obedience still offered protection. The Colombo family had removed a threat, but in doing so, it had also exposed its own fragility. For Cutolo's son, William Billy Cutolo Jr., the killing was not business, not hierarchy, not mafia logic, but a personal execution carried out under false pretenses. He absorbed the news through fragments, rumors, and denials, each one deepening his sense of betrayal. He reportedly told close confidants that his father had trusted the wrong people, that men he'd known his whole life had smiled while arranging his death. Unlike his father, Billy Jr. had grown up straddling two worlds, familiar with the mafia's codes but not fully owned by them. That distance allowed anger to override fear and grief to dissolve the instinct for silence. Where others lowered their voices, he raised questions. Where others accepted inevitability, he demanded accountability. As weeks turned into months, Billy Jr.'s anger sharpened into purpose, and his conversations grew more explicit. He spoke openly about who had lured his father to the meeting, who had authorized the hit, and who had benefited from his removal. In private moments, he reportedly said that the family had killed the wrong Kutolo, a statement that carried both pain and warning. Those who heard him tried to calm him, reminding him that retaliation only led to more graves. Others urged him to let it go, suggesting that survival meant acceptance. Billy Jr. listened, but he did not agree. The code that had protected the Mafia for generations meant nothing to a son who felt it had already been violated. The Colombo family underestimated the danger of that mindset. Assuming that grief would fade, or that fear would reassert itself, they failed to grasp that Billy Jr. was not bound by the same incentives as made men, that he had less to lose and more to expose. As law enforcement quietly applied pressure, offering clarity in exchange for cooperation, the path forward became stark. In one conversation, an agent reportedly told him that the men responsible would never answer to anyone unless he forced the issue. Billy Jr. did not respond immediately, but the idea took root. Justice, in whatever form was available, began to look preferable to silence. The Mafia had always relied on blood loyalty, and now blood loyalty was turning against it. When Billy Kutolo Jr. ultimately chose to cooperate, the decision sent shockwaves through the Colombo family that reverberated far beyond Brooklyn. His testimony was not vague or speculative. It was detailed, personal, and devastatingly precise. He spoke about meetings, names, timelines, and conversations that had once been considered safely buried. He described the tone of discussions, the casual way death had been authorized, and the certainty with which those involved believed they would never face consequences. Prosecutors listened as a family insider dismantled the narrative of order and honor piece by piece. For law enforcement, it was a rare gift. Betrayal fueled not by greed or self-preservation, but by grief. Inside the Mafia, the reaction was swift and panicked, as figures scrambled to assess the damage and distance themselves from the fallout. Conversations that once took place freely now ended abruptly, and longtime associates began avoiding one another. One Colombo figure reportedly muttered that Wild Bill was still causing problems from the grave, an acknowledgement that the decision to kill him had backfired catastrophically. Indictments followed, cases strengthened, and reputations crumbled as testimony filled gaps investigators had chased for years. The family's already weakened structure began to buckle under the weight of exposure. Silence, once enforced through fear, was no longer reliable. The broader consequence was not just legal, but cultural, as the Colombo family lost what little cohesion it had retained after decades of internal conflict. Younger members saw clearly that loyalty did not guarantee survival, and older members recognized that tradition no longer insulated them from consequence. The murder meant to stabilize the family had accelerated its decline, confirming that internal violence now carried existential risk. Meetings became rare, trust thinner, and authority fragmented. The family did not collapse overnight, but it never fully recovered its footing. Power drained away quietly, leaving behind a shell sustained more by memory than influence. In retrospect, a feud that led to Wild Bill Kutolo's death stands as a cautionary turning point, illustrating how the Mafia's greatest strength, absolute internal authority, became its greatest vulnerability. The organization believed it could manage violence internally without consequence, forgetting that loyalty is not inherited automatically by the next generation. By killing Kutolo, the family resolved a short-term problem while igniting a long-term catastrophe. Billy Kutolo Jr.'s cooperation shattered the illusion that blood ties guaranteed silence. The code failed where emotion intervened. In that failure, decades of secrecy unraveled. The legacy of the Kutolo feud is not one of vengeance fulfilled, but of exposure and erosion, a reminder that even the most insular criminal organizations depend on human restraint to survive. The Colombo family learned, too late, that fear cannot always suppress grief, and authority cannot always override betrayal when the betrayal comes from within the bloodline. Wild Bill Kutolo was removed to protect the family, yet his death became the catalyst for its further decline. In the end, the Mafia did not destroy its enemy, it created one. And that enemy spoke.
John "Sonny" Francis was a longtime member and former underboss of the Colombo crime family. His career in organized crime began in the 1930s and spanned over 8 decades. He served as underboss of the Colombo family from 1963 until 1967, when he was sentenced to 50 years in prison for orchestrating a number of bank robberies across the country. He was paroled in 1978. He was rejailed at least 6 times on parole violations in the decades that followed. He became Colombo family underboss again in 2005. He was convicted of extortion in 2011 and sentenced to 8 years in prison. His son, John Francis Jr., testified against him, becoming the first son of a New York mobster to turn state's evidence and testify against his father. At the time of his release on June 23, 2017, at the age of 100, he was the oldest federal inmate in the United States and the only centenarian in federal custody. He died in a New York City hospital on February 24, 2020, at the age of 103. John Frances was born in Naples, Italy, to Carmine Frances and Maria Corvola on February 6, 1917, according to the Federal Bureau of Prisons. His parents had already immigrated to the United States at the time of his birth, and were back in Italy for a visit. After 6 months, his family returned with Frances to their home in Greenpoint, Brooklyn, where his father ran a bakery. His mother gave him the nickname Sonny at a young age. In the late 1930s, he worked under Joseph Profaci, boss of the Profaci crime family, later named the Colombo crime family. His first arrest came in 1938 for assault. In 1942, in the midst of World War II, he was drafted to the US Army, but was discharged later that year, classified as psychoneurotic with pronounced homicidal tendencies. Court papers accused him of committing rape against a waitress in 1947, but he was never arrested in relation to the crime. Sonny operated out of New York City and New Jersey and was involved in racketeering, fraud, and loan sharking. He was also a regular at the Copacabana and met such stars as Frank Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr. on a frequent basis. He was also a boxing fan of Rocky Graziano. He became a made man in 1950 and served in the crew of Sebastian Buster Alloy, father of former Colombo family acting boss Vincenzo Alloy. He is believed to have been elevated to caporegime or captain in the Colombo family in the mid-1950s by Profaci. By 1963, he had been promoted to underboss by boss Joseph Colombo. In the 1950s and 1960s, Sonny listed his official occupation as an owner of a dry cleaning store in Brooklyn. In 1967, he gained a financial interest in a new recording company, Butter Records. He used Butter to launder illegal mob earnings and to bribe disc jockeys with payola. He also infiltrated and began to make money through the owner of Calla Records, Nate McCalla, until the recording label ceased operations in 1977, and McCalla was murdered execution-style in 1980. He was accused of murdering Genovese crime family hitman-turned-informant Ernest Rupolo in 1964 on the orders of Vito Genovese. Rupolo was shot and stabbed several times before his feet were attached to 2 concrete blocks and his hands tied before being dumped into Jamaica Bay. He was arrested with 9 other people on April 13, 1966, and during his trial, the prosecution produced records that claimed that Sonny had killed more than 30 people. He was later acquitted of the murder. However, on March 3, 1967, Francis was convicted in Albany, New York, of masterminding a series of 4 bank robberies across the country in 1965, and was finally sentenced to 50 years in prison at United States Penitentiary, Leavenworth, by Judge Jacob Mishler in 1970, after several denied appeals. His son, Michael, alleged that when Mishler sentenced his father, Francis declared, "You watch." I'm gonna do the whole 50-inch. His nephew Salvatore reportedly headed his gambling operations while he was in prison. In 1978, Franzese was released on parole but returned to prison in 1982 for a parole violation. In 1984, Sonny was released on parole again. Until 2008, he was never charged with another crime, although he would return to prison on parole violations on at least 6 occasions. After the 2004 incarceration of John Jackie DeRoss, Franzese was again promoted to Colombo family underboss in 2005, for the first time since his 1967 imprisonment by Thomas Gioli. However, in May 2007, Franzese was again returned to prison for a parole violation. In June 2008, John, still incarcerated, was indicted on charges of participating in murders during the Colombo Wars of the early 1990s, stealing fur coats in New York City in the mid-1990s, and participating in home invasions by police impersonators in Los Angeles in 2006. On June 4, 2008, Franzese was indicted along with other Colombo mobsters on charges of racketeering, conspiracy, robbery, extortion, narcotics trafficking, and loan sharking. On December 24, 2008, he was released from the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn. According to law enforcement, he remained the official underboss of the Colombo family. Franzese's son, John Franzese Jr., became a government informant. Jr. was allegedly also responsible for his father's 4th parole violation, but was accepted back into his confidence after denying the allegations in tears, saying, "I would never do that, no matter what kind of trouble I had." In 2005, he wore a wire around his father. John Franzese Jr. testified twice against his father, the last time his father attempted to have him killed. He later lived under witness protection. In 2010, Franzese Jr. admitted that he received $50,000 from the FBI as a cooperating witness. He is the first son of a New York mobster to turn state's evidence and testify against his father. With the help of Franzese Jr.'s testimony, the 93-year-old Franzese Sr., on January 14, 2011, was sentenced to 8 years in prison for extorting 2 Manhattan strip clubs, running a loan shark operation, and extorting a pizzeria on Long Island. Prosecutors had asked for a sentence of 12 years, while Sonny's lawyer asked for leniency based on a variety of ailments, including partial blindness and deafness, gout, and heart and kidney problems. Franzese was denied compassionate release in July 2016. Franzese was released from the Federal Medical Center in Devens, Massachusetts, on June 23, 2017, at the age of 100. He was the oldest federal inmate in the United States and the only centenarian in federal custody at the time of his release.
If you haven't already, please take a second to subscribe to the channel, and also don't forget to click on the notification bell so you'll be up to date on all videos released from the Everything Network.
Carmine Persico was born in Brooklyn, New York. His father was a legal stenographer for several law firms in Manhattan. His brothers Theodore Persico and Alphonse Aliboy Persico also became captains in the Colombo crime family. His son, named Alphonse after the boy's uncle and commonly known as Little Ali Boy, eventually became a mafia captain as well. He was the uncle of Theodore Persico Jr. The family lived in the Carroll Gardens and Red Hook sections of Brooklyn. He dropped out of high school at age 16. By then, he was a leader of the Garfield Boys, a Brooklyn street gang. However, one contemporary source says that in 1950, he had actually belonged to the South Brooklyn Boys, a successor gang to the Garfield Boys. In March 1951, a 17-year-old Carmine was arrested on charges of fatally beating another youth in Brooklyn's Prospect Park. However, all charges were eventually dropped. In the early 1950s, he was recruited into the Profassi crime family, the forerunner of the Colombo family, by longtime capo Frank Abbatemarco. At first, Persico did bookmaking and loan sharking, then moved into burglaries and hijackings. During this decade, he was arrested over 12 times, but spent only a few days in jail. He also started working with Joe Gallo and his brothers, Albert and Lawrence. Persico allegedly participated in the murder of Albert Anastasia in 1957, the former leader of Murder Inc., and the boss of what was then the Anastasia family. Anastasia's underboss, Carlo Gambino, wanted control of the family and conspired with his allies, Genovese family boss Vito Genovese and Profasci boss Joe Profasci, to kill Anastasia. Profasci allegedly gave the job to Persico and the Gallo brothers. On October 25, 1957, Anastasia entered the barber shop of the Park Sheraton Hotel in Midtown Manhattan. As he relaxed in the barber chair, two men, with scarves covering their faces, rushed in, shoved the barber out of the way, and fired at Anastasia. After the first volley of bullets, Anastasia allegedly lunged at his killers. However, the stunned Anastasia had actually attacked the gunman's reflections in the wall mirror of the barber shop. The gunmen continued firing, finally killing Anastasia. No one was ever charged in the Anastasia killing, and there is an alternative theory that gunmen from the Patriarcha crime family of New England performed the hit. By the late 1950s, Persico and the Gallos were becoming increasingly dissatisfied with Profasci's leadership. The boss demanded high tribute payments from family members and was viewed as a wealthy autocrat. The First Colombo War started on November 4, 1959, when the boss's gunman murdered Abbatemarco on a Brooklyn street. Abbatemarco had stopped paying tribute to the boss earlier that year with the support of the Gallo faction. It is speculated that Carlo Gambino and Lucchese family boss Tommy Lucchese were encouraging the Gallos to challenge Profasci, their enemy. When Profasci took Abbatemarco's lucrative rackets away from the Gallos, the warfare began. On February 27, 1961, the Gallos, led by Joe Gallo, kidnapped four of Profasci's top men, underboss Joseph Magliocco, Frank Profasci, the boss's brother, Captain Salvatore Musacchia, and soldier John Simone. Profasci himself eluded capture and flew to sanctuary in Florida. While holding the hostages, Larry and Albert Gallo sent Joe Gallo to California. Profasci's capo, and later underboss John Sonny Frances, negotiated with the Gallos, and all the hostages were released peacefully. However, the boss had no intention of honoring this peace agreement. On August 20, 1961, the boss ordered the murder of Gallo members Joseph Joe Jelly Gioielli and Larry Gallo. Gunmen allegedly murdered Gioielli after inviting him to go deep-sea fishing. Gallo survived a strangulation attempt in the Sahara Club of East Flatbush by Persico and Salvatore Sally D'Ambrosio after a police officer intervened. The Gallos then began calling Persico the Snake. He had betrayed them. The war continued on, resulting in 9 murders and 3 disappearances. Persico was indicted later that year for the attempted murder of Gallo, but the charges were dropped when Gallo refused to testify. On June 6, 1962, Joe died of cancer and Magliocco became the new family boss. However, the war with the Gallo faction continued. In early 1963, Persico survived a car bombing, and his enforcer, Hugh McIntosh, was shot in the groin as he attempted to kill Larry Gallo. On May 19, 1963, Gallo gunmen ambushed Carmine in the Gowanus section of Brooklyn. A panel truck pulled alongside Carmine's car, and 2 men shot him in the face, hand and shoulder. Persico reportedly spat out the bullet that had entered his face. Soon after this attempt on his life, Persico was imprisoned on extortion charges. By the fall of 1963, with Joey Gallo also imprisoned, the shooting war had ended with Magliocco the winner. In late 1963, after an unsuccessful attempt to take over the commission, Magliocco was forced into retirement. He was replaced by Colombo, who had alerted the commission to Magliocco's plot. The Profassi crime family was now the Colombo crime family. In turn, Colombo rewarded the imprisoned Persico by naming him a captain. After being promoted to captain, Persico was constantly on the streets. He was involved in labor racketeering, extortion, loan sharking, hijacking, illegal gambling, and especially murder for hire. By the late 1960s, Persico's crew was one of the most profitable in the Colombo family. In 1968, Persico was convicted on federal hijacking charges after 5 separate trials dating back to 1960. On January 27, 1972, he was finally sent to prison on these charges, where he would spend 8 years. The trial was noted for the only appearance of former mobster Joseph Valachi as a prosecution witness. In 1973, Carmine was imprisoned on hijacking and loan sharking charges and sentenced to 8 years in prison. His incarceration coincided with the release of his brother Alphonse from 17 years in prison. Persico designated Alphonse as acting boss, with support as underboss from Gennaro Langella and Carmine's other brother, Theodore. Langella supervised various labor rackets for the family, including their stake in the Concrete Club, and exerted control over various labor unions, including Cement and Concrete Workers District Council, Local 6A. In 1979, Persico was released from federal prison. On August 11, 1981, he pleaded guilty to a conspiracy charge of attempting to bribe an IRS agent from 1977 to 78 while in federal custody. The evidence included a recording of Persico offering the agent $250,000 in exchange for getting him an early release from prison. On November 9, 1981, Persico was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. On October 14, 1984, Persico and the rest of the Colombo family leadership were indicted on multiple racketeering charges as part of the Colombo trial. After the indictment was published, he went into hiding. On October 26, the FBI began a national manhunt for the mafia boss, and soon named him as the 390th fugitive to be added to their 10 most wanted list. Carmine hid in the home of his brother-in-law and minor mob associate Fred DeChristopher in Hempstead, New York. Unbeknownst to Persico, DeChristopher had been relaying information to the FBI for the previous 2 years after being caught up in a sting operation, and had already told the Bureau of Persico's whereabouts. The FBI concocted the fake manhunt to shield DeChristopher, who would later provide damning testimony against Persico as a key witness for the prosecution. Persico was arrested on February 15, 1985, at the home of DeChristopher. An FBI agent actually called the residence and spoke with Persico, telling him the house was surrounded. Persico and another mob associate that had been visiting him surrendered peacefully. Persico pleaded not guilty along with 11 other New York Mafia leaders on July 1st, after a previous indictment on a second set of racketeering charges as part of the Mafia Commission trial. Prosecutors aimed to strike at all the crime families at once, using their involvement in the commission. According to Colombo hitman and FBI informant Gregory Scarpa, Persico and Gambino boss John Gotti backed a plan to kill the lead prosecutor and future New York mayor, Rudy Giuliani, in late 1986, but it was rejected by the rest of the commission. At the start of the commission trial, Carmine decided to serve as his own lawyer. He believed that his history of convictions gave him sufficient experience to defend himself. His co-defendants vehemently disagreed with this decision, and the judge warned Persico that he would be waiving incompetent counsel as the grounds for an appeal. He received counsel from lawyers to help guide him when the prosecutors questioned him. He tried to project a friendly image to the jury and urged them to put aside any preconceptions about the Mafia or Cosa Nostra. Many believe that Persico inadvertently sabotaged his own defense by acknowledging criminal activities during his cross-examinations of prosecution witnesses. On June 14, 1986, he was convicted of racketeering in the Colombo trial. On November 17, he was sentenced to 39 years in prison. The sentencing judge, John F. Keenan, nonetheless praised the mob boss's performance as his own lawyer in the commission trial and said, "Mr. Persico, you're a tragedy. You are one of the most intelligent people I have ever seen in my life." On November 19th, Carmine and the other commission trial defendants were convicted on all charges. On January 13th, 1987, Keenan sentenced Persico to 100 years in prison to run consecutively with his 39-year sentence in the Colombo trial, a $240,000 fine, and given no option for parole. The New York Times organized crime writer Selwyn Raab thought the Colombos were the most damaged by the trial, even though most of the top leaders of New York's mafia families were sent to prison, with the Lucchese's losing their entire hierarchy. In his book, 5 Families, Raab noted that Persico was only 53 years old at the time of the commission trial, making him by far the youngest boss in New York. However, Raab noted, Persico had already led the family for 14 years and was at the peak of his abilities. He believed Persico would have potentially had a long reign ahead of him had he not been taken off the streets. By comparison, the other bosses were in their 70s and would have likely passed the reins to men of Persico's generation, even without the trial intervening. Persico was sent to United States Penitentiary near Marion, Illinois, to serve his combined 139-year sentence. By 2017, Persico was in the medium-security Federal Correctional Complex in Butner, North Carolina. The facility has medical facilities for elderly inmates. Press reports indicated he had become friends with convicted fraudster Bernie Madoff. In June 1987, Persico ordered acting boss Joel Cacace to kill lawyer William Aronwald, a retired prosecutor who had allegedly been disrespectful to the mafia. Joel delegated the job to 2 hitmen who mistakenly killed Aronwald's father George. In response to outrage from the other New York families, he recruited 2 more gunmen to kill the first hit team. After those murders were accomplished, Joel killed the second set of gunmen. In 2004, he would plead guilty to the Aronwald murder. No charges were filed against Persico. Persico realized that he would likely die in prison and would thus never be able to resume active control of the family. He was, however, determined to ensure that his cut of the Colombo rackets continued to flow to his relatives. To that end, soon after he was sentenced, he named his brother, Ali Boy, as acting boss. He did not reign long, though. He was arrested for loan sharking and averted bail. Persico then named a 3-man ruling panel to run the family. In 1988, he dissolved the panel and named Victor Little Vic Orena, a loyal captain from Brooklyn, as temporary acting boss. While giving Orena the power to induct members and order murders on his own authority, unusual for an acting boss, Persico made it clear that Orena was merely a placeholder until Persico's son, Junior, was released from prison. Indeed, Persico picked Orena in part because he was the captain of his brother's old crew. Knowing that Persico Jr. would be 40 years old by the time he was paroled, Carmine wanted to ensure that his son would be able to inherit the family's riches as soon as he was released. In 1990, the government transferred Carmine to what was then the United States Penitentiary in Lompoc, California. There he established an Italian cultural club for the inmates. He socialized with people such as Patriarca family consigliere Joseph Russo and mafia associate Anthony Senta. Persico formed the Lompoc Four, a band in which Russo played guitar and Persico played drums. By 1991, Arena had become disgruntled with the current leadership scheme and was tired of the constant stream of orders that he received from Persico in prison. He also grew to resent that he would have to turn over the family to little Ali Boy. Gotti encouraged Arena's rebellion, since he and Persico had long been enemies, and went so far as to label Persico a rat, the worst possible accusation for a mob figure. In the spring of 1991, Arena made a push to become boss in his own right. You're watching the Everything Network. By 1991, Arena had come to believe Persico was out of touch and causing the family to miss out on lucrative opportunities. He was also alarmed at Persico's plans for a made-for-television biography, fearing that prosecutors could use it as evidence in the same way they had used Joe Bonanno's tell-all book as evidence in the commission trial. He therefore decided to take over the family himself. Using his strong ties to Gambino boss John Gotti, Arena petitioned the Mafia Commission to recognize him as boss. Unwilling to cause more conflict, the commission refused. Arena then instructed consigliere Carmine Sessa to poll the capos on whether Arena should replace Persico. Instead, Sessa alerted Persico that Arena was staging an organizational takeover. An enraged Persico ordered a hit on Arena. On June 21, 1991, when Arena arrived at his home in Cedarhurst on Long Island, he found gunmen under Sessa's leadership waiting for him. However, Arena managed to escape before the gunmen could strike. The Third Colombo War had begun. Arena sent his younger brother Michael, Mickey Brown, Arena's two sons, Michael and younger son William, Willie Boy Arena, into Brooklyn on a murder mission. It is unclear what roles the two brothers played in the murders during the war, but FBI agents are certain they were responsible for the disappearance of 15 associates and business partners of the Arena clan. William Willie Boy Arena was picked up getting off of the Fire Island ferry in Sayville, Long Island, with 8 pistols believed to be used in the bloodshed and $43,000 in cash in his possession. During Willie Boy's stay at the Riverhead County Jail, all 8 of the firearms disappeared from the evidence locker. 12 people, including 3 innocent bystanders, died in this gang war, and 18 associates have never been seen again. More than 80 made members and associates from both sides of the Colombo family were convicted, jailed, or indicted. These included Persico's brother Theodore Teddy Persico and his son Alphonse Persico de Ross, Arena's nephews William Arena, his older brother Michael Arena, and Arena's 2 sons, Victor Jr. Arena and John Arena. While both sides appealed to the commission for help, the war continued. In November 1991, Gregory Scarpa, a Persico loyalist, was driving his daughter and granddaughter home when several Arena gunmen ambushed them. Scarpa and his relatives managed to escape. The war continued until 1992, when Arena was convicted of racketeering, the 1989 Osera murder, and other related charges. He received 3 life sentences plus 85 years in federal prison. 58 soldiers and associates, 42 from the Persico faction and 16 from the Arena faction, were sent to prison. Raab later wrote that Persico's attempts to keep control of the family from prison nearly destroyed it. By his estimate, 70 of the family's members and associates were convicted as a result of the war, and the family was down to around 75 made members. While the Colombo War raged, the commission refused to allow any Colombo member to sit on the commission and considered dissolving the family. Lucchese underboss Anthony Casso proposed to merge the family with his own to end the war, while in 2000, plans were proposed to split its manpower and resources among the remaining families. In 2002, with the help of Bonanno family boss Joseph Massino, the other families finally allowed the Colombos to rejoin the commission. With Arena out of the picture, the way was clear for Little Alley Boy to become acting boss after his release in 1994. In 1994, Carmine Persico appointed Andrew Russo as acting boss. When Russo went to prison in 1996, Alphonse Persico took over as acting boss. In 1999, he was arrested in Fort Lauderdale after being caught in possession of a pistol and shotgun. As a convicted felon, he was barred from carrying guns. Shortly afterward, he ordered the murder of underboss William Wild Bill Cutolo, an Arena supporter during the Third Colombo War. Cutolo's son, vowing revenge, offered to wear a wire and pose as a prospective Colombo associate. Based on evidence from this wire, Little Alley Boy was indicted on RICO charges. Realizing he stood no chance of acquittal, he pled guilty to the state charges in February 2000 and to the RICO charges in December 2001. In 2004, Alphonse Persico and underboss John Jackie DeRoss were indicted for the Cutolo murder. In December 2007, both men were convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Family consigliere Joe Waverley took over running the family until 2003, when he was imprisoned on murder and racketeering charges. The family then came under the influence of Tommy Shots Gioli, who took over as street boss. In June 2008, Gioli, underboss John Sonny Franzese, former consigliere Joel Qatar, Captain Dino Calabro, Soldier Dino Saracino, and several other members and associates, including Orlando Ori Spado, were indicted on multiple racketeering charges, including loan sharking, extortion, and 3 murders dating back to the Colombo Wars. Alphonse Persico was sentenced to life imprisonment on February 27, 2009, for the Cutolo murder. After Gioli was imprisoned, Ralph F. DeLeo, who operated from Boston, Massachusetts, became the family's street boss. On December 17, 2009, the FBI charged DeLeo and Colombo family members with drug trafficking, extortion, and loan sharking in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New York, Florida, and Arkansas. With DeLeo imprisoned, Andy Mush Russo once again took control of the family. On January 20, 2011, street boss Andrew Russo, acting underboss Benjamin Castellazzo, consigliere Richard Fusco, and others were charged with murder, narcotics trafficking, and labor racketeering. In September 2011, Castellazzo and Fusco pleaded guilty to reduced charges. In December 2011, it was revealed that Capo Reynold Maragni wore a wire for the FBI and gained information about Thomas Gioli's role in the 1999 murder of William Cutolo. On July 11, 2018, 4 associates and members of the Colombo crime family were part of a 32-count indictment charging them with a number of crimes, including money laundering, racketeering, illegal gambling, and extortion. The crimes allegedly took place between December 2010 and June 2018, predominantly in Brooklyn and Staten Island. 2 made members of the Colombo family, Vito DeFalco and Jerry Sciori, were among the accused. Gambino crime family soldier Anthony Licata was also indicted. On March 7, 2019, Colombo family boss Carmine Persico died in prison. With Carmine Persico's death, his son Alphonse Persico was passed over, and his cousin Andrew Mush Russo became the official boss of the Colombo family. Russo's inner circle included underboss Benji Castellazzo, consigliere Ralph Di Matteo, Capo Vincent Vinny Unions Ricciardo, Captain Richard Ferrara, and Capo Theodore Teddy Persico Jr. On October 3, 2019, Capo Joseph Amato, along with Daniel Capaldo and Thomas Scorsia, were indicted on 2014 Staten Island extortion, and loan sharking charges. On March 22, 2021, Amato pleaded guilty. On August 13, 2020, an indictment charged Colombo family associate Francesco "Frankie" Russo, Genovese family soldier Christopher Cierchio, attorney Jason J. Kurland, and securities broker Frank Smukler with conspiracy, wire fraud, and money laundering. The indictment accused the lottery attorney Kurland, along with Russo, Cierchio, and Smukler, of swindling $80 million from jackpot winners in an illegal scheme which involved siphoning money from the winners' investments. Francesco "Frankie" Russo has been identified as the son of former Colombo captain Joseph "Jojo" Russo and the grandson of Andrew "Mush" Russo, the reputed boss of the Colombo family. On September 14, 2021, an indictment was served that included the Colombo family's official boss, Andrew "Mush" Russo, underboss Benjamin "Benji" Castellazzo, consigliere Ralph "Big Ralphie" Di Matteo, captains Vincent Ricciardi, Richard Ferrara and Theodore "Teddy" Persico Jr., soldier Michael Uvino, and associates Thomas Costa and Domenic Ricciardo. The indictment charged these members of the Colombo family with infiltrating and taking control of a Queens-based labor union and its affiliated healthcare benefit program, as well as conspiring to commit fraud in connection with workplace safety certifications. Ralph Di Matteo was not present when the indictment was served and was declared a fugitive, but surrendered to the FBI on September 17, 2021. Richard Ferrara became a governor, providing information which helped convict 2 Russian gangsters of lying to the FBI about the 2009 murder of a Russian businessman. In December 2023, the remaining defendants were sentenced to prison. Ralph Di Matteo received 3 years, Theodore Persico received 5 years, and Benjamin Castellazzo was given 15 months. On April 20, 2022, Andrew Russo's lawyer Jeffrey Lichtman announced that Russo died at the age of 87 on April 18, 2022. On April 23, 2022, Andrew Russo's funeral was attended by 100 mourners in Brooklyn. Little Robert D'Onofrio, a longtime soldier who initially sided with the Arena faction but switched to the Persico faction during the Third War, ascended to the family's administration, becoming the acting boss after Russo's death. You're watching the Everything Network. William Wild Bill Cutolo was born and raised in the Brooklyn borough of New York City. William Sr. was the brother of Gertrude, Barbara, and Geraldine Cutolo. He had 3 daughters and a son named William Jr., to previous wife Marguerite Butera. In 1990, Cutolo had his 3rd daughter, Dana, with his wife Bette Ann Fox from Brooklyn. William Jr. followed his father into illegal gambling and loan sharking and was eventually convicted of extortion and racketeering. Cutolo was also involved with several charities. He was a fundraising chairman and board member for the National Leukemia Research Association in Garden City, New York. Cutolo sat on the Medical Advisory Committee as chairman of Team Leukemia and was associated with the New York chapter of the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society in Rye Brook, New York. He helped raise $400,000 for International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers Local 204, as well as many other locals over the years. In 1988, Cutolo was honored as the National Leukemia Association's Man of the Year. Cutolo paid for their holiday parties and dressed up every year as Santa Claus for the National Children's Leukemia Association in Borough Park, Brooklyn, as his son, William Jr., handed out gifts and posed for pictures with the stricken children. He rose up the ranks of the Colombo crime family during the late 1980s under acting boss Victor Arena. Originally a soldier in Captain Pasquale Amato's crew, He soon became one of the family's more powerful leaders. Cutolo was successful because he made much money and commanded a crew of hitmen. His crew included Joseph Patillo, Dominic Dionisio, Michael Spataro, Ralph Guccione, Vincent Chicky DiMartino, Michael Donato, and his son William Cutolo Jr. Cutolo earned the nickname Billy Fingers because he was missing one finger and another one was mutilated due to an occupational accident at a hamburger store. In 1989, he earned his nickname Wild Bill after beating a man with a baseball bat. Cutolo was fond of cowboy boots and frequently wore a large brown 10-gallon hat. He operated Bill's Friendly Bocce Social Club in the Bath Beach section of Brooklyn as his headquarters. Cutolo was the best man at mobster John Jackie DeRoss's wedding, the man who would eventually participate in his murder. Unyielding in negotiations and harsh with his crew members, Bill made no secret of his ambition to become boss of the Colombo family. During the 1980s, Cutolo became the president and business agent for Teamsters Union Local 861 in New York. However, in 1990, Cutolo resigned his positions the day before the Teamsters Union was planning to expel him for organized crime ties. Cutolo also gained control of District Council 37, a local of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. Cutolo and his close friend mobster Thomas Donado used Council 37 to steer jobs to Colombo associates and spending towards Colombo-controlled vendors and resorts. Cutolo was not afraid to use intimidation to maintain power. In 1990, Cutolo sent thugs to beat up 72-year-old Vincent Parisi, the head of a laborers' union local with colon cancer. During a meeting several days earlier, Parisi had cursed at Cutolo and thrown a paper ball at his face. In 1998, New York City newspapers reported on links between Council 37 and the National Leukemia Research Foundation, Cutolo's favorite charity. Investigators questioned whether cash donations from union officials were actually being received by the foundation. During the 1990s, Cutolo also became vice president of the new Local 400 of the Industrial and Production Workers Union, a city workers' union. He was later accused of using the union's name to receive money from companies seeking to avoid union organizers. Cutolo also extorted money from companies such as Embassy Terrace, a Brooklyn caterer. The company was in severe financial trouble when it approached Cutolo for help. In return, his investment, Cutolo gained control over the enterprise. Cutolo also controlled several restaurants and nightclubs in New York and Miami, Florida. In 1998, Cutolo and mobster Vincent "Vinny Ocean" Palermo allegedly formed a partnership with German corporation Siemens AG behind dummy investors on a cell phone deal in Russia. In 1991, Cutolo became enmeshed in a bloody war for control of the Colombo family. Acting boss Victor Arena had challenged Carmine Persico, still in prison, on the naming of his son Alphonse Persico as acting boss. Cutolo was one of Arena's strongest allies. On June 21, 1991, the bloodshed started with an unsuccessful assassination attempt by the Persico faction on Arena. On November 18, 1991, in response to the Arena attack, Cutolo sent a team to ambush Persico loyalist Gregory Scarpa as he was driving with his daughter and granddaughter. Scarpa and his family managed to escape harm. 5 days after the Scarpa hit, Cutolo led a hit team that killed Persico loyalist Henry Smurra outside a Brooklyn donut shop. In another incident, Cutolo was driving away from a Sheepshead Bay Brooklyn social club when he spotted Persico loyalist Joel Cacace. The two men traded shots on the street, wounding Cacace. After Arena's imprisonment in 1992, the Colombo War ended in October 1993 with a Persico victory after the murder of Arena captain Joseph Scopo. Investigators concluded that Cutolo was personally responsible for 3 of the 12 murders committed during this conflict. To punish Cutolo for his support of Arena, Carmine Persico temporarily demoted him from capo to soldier. Carmine Persico was also angry that Cutolo had called him a rat for admitting the existence of the Cosa Nostra at the 1985 Mafia Commission trial. Despite his demotion, Cutolo eventually reconciled with Persico after the war, or so he thought. The family had been decimated, but the Mafia Commission would not allow the induction of new members until the 2 warring factions made peace. In early 1999, after Alphonse Persico was released from prison, Carmine Persico promoted Cutolo to underboss as a peace gesture. However, the situation changed when Alphonse Persico was sentenced to prison in Florida on a gun possession charge. The Persicos and De Ross were afraid that Cutolo would seize control of the family in Alphonse Persico's absence and decided to murder Cutolo. On May 26, 1999, Alphonse Persico summoned Cutolo to a meeting. Cutolo's mechanic dropped him off in Bayside Park to meet with Persico. After Cutolo arrived at the park, Thomas Gielli, Dino Saracino, and Dino Calabro allegedly transported Cutolo to the basement of Saracino's house, where they murdered him. Gielli then allegedly buried Cutolo at an industrial park in Farmingdale, New York. A few years later, Gambino crime family captain Mikey Scars DiLeonardo testified that when he arrived at this meeting, Alphonse Persico and De Ross told him that Cutolo was gone. The day after the Cutolo murder, De Ross unsuccessfully ransacked Cutolo's home office in Staten Island for Cutolo's loan sharking records. On May 26, 1999, Alphonse Persico summoned him to a meeting. Cutolo's mechanic dropped him off in Bayside Park to meet with Persico. After Bill arrived at the park, Thomas Gielli, Dino Saracino, and Dino Calabro allegedly transported him to the basement of Saracino's house, where they murdered him. Gielli then allegedly buried him at an industrial park in Farmingdale, New York. A few years later, Gambino crime family captain Mikey Scars DiLeonardo testified that when he arrived at this meeting, Alphonse Persico and De Ross told him that Cutolo was gone. The day after this murder, De Ross unsuccessfully ransacked Bill's home office in Staten Island for Cutolo's loan sharking records and a $1.5 million cash stash, hidden in a stove vent. During that visit and succeeding ones, De Ross warned Cutolo's family not to make any statements to police that linked Persico or the Colombo family to the shooting. De Ross became the new underboss. In 2001, Cutolo's family formally joined the Witness Protection Program. William Jr. would be removed from the program in 2006 due to an extortion conviction. In a 2002 hearing in surrogate court, a judge pronounced him dead in absentia. In 2004, Alphonse Persico and De Ross were indicted for conspiring to murder Wild Bill. However, on November 4, 2004, the first trial ended as a mistrial because the jury deadlocked over a case with just circumstantial evidence and no body. On November 7, 2007, the second trial began. On December 28, 2007, Persico and De Ross were convicted of Cutolo's murder. The evidence in the second trial now included undercover recordings of Persico and De Ross made by William Jr. for the FBI, as well as crucial testimony by William Sr.'s wife, Peggy. In December 2008, Gielli, Saracino, and Calabro were also indicted in the Cutolo murder. On February 27, 2009, Persico and De Ross were sentenced to life imprisonment for the Cutolo murder. In February 2010, Dino Calabro became a government witness. It was likely that he would testify against Gielli and Saracino in the Cutolo murder trial. In October 2008, acting on an informant's information, federal agents started searching a field in East Farmingdale, New York. They soon unearthed the body of a man wrapped in a blue tarpaulin. The man was wearing Italian loafers. A forensic dentist later confirmed that the body was that of William Cotolo Sr. In 2008, 9 years after his murder, Cotolo was interred at the Cemetery of the Resurrection, Staten Island.